This is one of those stories that just has a grisly ending. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. This is one of the more interesting missing 411 cases that we've ever covered, not necessarily because of what happened at the end, which is still weird, but more because we have a lot more information about the person who went missing than we usually do, which means I can actually tell his story before getting to the part where he disappeared. And his story is important to the way in which he disappeared and the presumed manner of death. This is the story of Bart Schleyer. Now, here's a guy who spent his entire life learning about animals, studying animals, not just for the sake of hunting them, but also a deeper understanding. This is a guy who worked for the government, who worked for himself, who went off and tracked Siberian tigers. And speaking of understanding, I was at a loss trying to understand how I could get compensation after my Bigfoot attack. I was injured and I did not know where to start. But with Morgan & Morgan, it was so simple. After being picked up and thrown into a tree like a possessed Raggedy Ann doll, I was unable to move for several weeks. But with Morgan & Morgan, you can submit a claim without ever leaving the couch. That's right, in 8 clicks or less, you can submit a claim to Morgan & Morgan. If you're ever in an accident, Bigfoot related or not, you can check out Morgan & Morgan. You can go to forthepeople.com or dial pound law, that's pound 529, from your cell phone. Bart Schleyer was born to Otis and Lula Schleyer in 1955 in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Otis was a physician, but more importantly for this story, Otis was an avid hunter. He took his son on normal hunts as well as African safaris in Mozambique. So throughout the entire early part of Bart's life, his father was helping foster this love of animals. Something that later on, he wouldn't love the result of, which was that Bart spent his life as kind of a traveler and a nomad and didn't really settle down in the way his family expected him to. But for the time being, his father was perfectly happy to teach him about animals, take him out in the wilderness, and foster a growing love of artistry within his son Bart. And because they grew up in Wyoming, where hunting is kind of a normal thing to do for fun, he and his friend Glenn Garton got very accustomed to going out in the woods on their own. They would go out on hunting trips, fishing trips, and simple camping trips, and over time, they both became absolute experts of the craft. As a child and an adolescent, Bart was hunting with guns, but when his older sister started dating a man named Jim, he was introduced to bow hunting. He simply fell in love with the sport of archery to the extent that it became his preferred method of hunting. Jim taught Bart on recurve bows, and if you've never fired a recurve bow, it's kind of the middle ground between a composite simple horse archery bow or something like that you're going to look at that's going to be smaller, and a full-sized long bow. These are mid-strength bows, very, very simple to use, and a really decent archery tool. It's probably my favorite to shoot with personally, because the draw weight isn't hard enough to really cause problems. A longbow is very, very difficult to draw. They're very heavy. A recurve manages to mix the power with the ease of draw, and that's a reason why they've remained so popular. At one point, Jim and Bart did try using compound bows to hunt, but while aiming at an elk, Jim's bow actually snapped and caused several lacerations on his hands and ribs. So as you can understand, they went back to the safer recurve bows. One thing that everybody who ever hunted with Bart said was that he had an incredible talent for the outdoors and for hunting. He was a once-in-a-generation kind of guy. And part of that was that they said he could almost talk to the animals. And I don't appreciate the irony of that timing. One thing people said was that Bart could talk to animals. That is uncanny. How? What is going on with him?
You're doing it on purpose.
How do you know that? How do you know what to do there? Bart's hunting companions said that it was as if he could talk to animals. And this came not just from a love of hunting and a natural instinct for it, but because Bart was a scientific mind who genuinely cared about studying what he was doing, not just doing things by feel. Jim remarked on an occasion where, while hunting, it became so foggy that he and Bart actually couldn't see where they were going. They could not navigate their way back to safety. So they just sat down, and not willing to waste the trip, Bart started making elk calls. After a short time of Bart, making the sound of a female elk, a bull just wandered up to them straight out of the mist, stared at them from a little ways away, and then meandered out of view. And if you're wondering why they didn't shoot it, well, what would you do if an elk just appeared out of the mist, stared at you, kind of gave you a sup, and left? Second only to his skill for hunting was Bart's skill for pranks. In fact, his sister Claudia referred to his sense of humor as being essential to his personality. Bart loved practical jokes and sending funny postcards and pictures around to his family and friends, and while most other hunters would typically, pack as little as possible, Bart would lug around all sorts of props, including costumes, for his hunts so that when he got a particularly, interesting kill, he could stand there in a clown costume. Bart was also known for bringing along his cat, Sparky, basically everywhere he went. And of course, he had found Sparky huddled up behind a furnace when it was younger, and, decided to rescue this little cat and just keep it by his side. Now, the thing about Sparky is that he was a dead mummified cat. Most people found this rather morbid, but Bart thought it was hilarious. And furthermore, everybody who talked about Bart would just gush about his kindness, his generosity, and his humility. This was not a man who was out bragging about what he was doing or trying to make himself seem special. He was just at peace out in the wild and loved the art of hunting. Bart was also a state champion wrestler in high school and ended up getting a scholarship to Sheridan College as a result. There, he earned his associate's degree studying art and wildlife before heading on to the larger Montana State University. And in college, you can imagine that Bart was a total party animal, except it was not so much partying as sorts of odd tests of sheer mental will. He underwent something called the Coyote Test. And the Coyote Test was exactly what it sounds like, a competition in which people brought just weird, gross pieces of meat to eat. And the goal, I assume, based on the limited information available, was to just pass the test by eating the weird meat. And Bart's version of passing the test was to eat raw skunk. The man was simply an apex predator with absolutely no time for squeamishness. Exploits like his hunting activities and eating raw skunk during the Coyote Test earned him the nickname of Wolverine while he was at Sheridan. And his friends would go on to say that this behavior, this ability to simply survive on the bare essentials and not need the comforts of modern life, was a huge aid to Bart as a hunter. It was something he took with him everywhere he went, whether that was Yellowstone, Alaska, or Russia. He took trips and hunts that for most hunters would require a great deal of courage, and made them with confidence because he knew he was going to be fine. At Montana State, Bart earned his bachelor's and his master's, and one professor, a Dan Collins, remarked that Bart was a student who stood out even amongst the over 42,000 who had come through his Man and the Environment class. Also, it was Don Collins, not Dan Collins, my apologies. Don remarked that it was as if Bart had prepared his whole life for this career and this profession that he was studying to get into, adding that Bart was superbly suited for the demands of that job. And as a master's student, Bart would write his thesis on the movement patterns of grizzly bears. And upon reading the thesis, Don remarked that Bart would have made a fantastic grad school professor, partially because he lacked the ego that often comes along with high-level university professors. Often you need a certain degree of narcissism to enjoy that kind of job and feel like you should be doing it, but Bart didn't have any of that, and maybe that's why he didn't go into teaching, but rather went into wildlife conservation and study. Out of college, Bart took a job working for Fish and Wildlife and also took part in the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, which is composed of agents from the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, the U.S. Geological Survey, Fish and Wildlife, and the Forest Service, along with Shoshone, Arapaho, and state-level agencies. So this is a very, very, very intertwined organization of people studying grizzly bears. In case you're wondering what somebody at the Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team does, they literally put radio tracking collars on grizzly bears. And those are grizzly bears, not to be confused with the far less dangerous glizzy bear or the far more dangerous gritty bear. In case you're wondering exactly how dangerous an adult male grizzly is, let me run you some statistics here. They're about 8 feet tall on their hind legs, which is usually something they don't stand on unless they're curious about something. And they weigh up to 800 pounds. And most importantly, they can run very fast, faster than you. The good news is, grizzly bears are not going to just see you across a field and charge at you. Typically, they'll only attack you if you find a mother with her cubs, or if you bother them. Now, that said, a starving grizzly will absolutely charge and eat you, so it's good to not, get too close to them, but you don't need to worry if you just see one from afar. That said, if you approach a grizzly bear and try to put a collar on it and it's not properly tranquilized, it will kill you. So Bart's line of work kind of introduced him to the most dangerous form of hunting, which is hunting something very deadly without the intention of killing it. And he honed his skills by hunting with his friends. After school, he met Paul Schaefer, who during college was absolutely nothing like Bart. He was an arrogant jock type. But as the two became friends and knew each other better and hunted together, everyone said that Paul actually became more mild-mannered, more humble, more generous, a better person just from being around Bart. At the same time, Paul was a very skilled bow hunter and even a bowyer. He actually built his own bows. And he taught Bart how to hunt with much higher draw weight bows. He made Bart a bow with a 90-pound draw weight, and in case you're wondering exactly how heavy that is, medieval longbows ranged from 150 to 180 pounds draw weight, shot 450 to 1,000 yards, and would punch through metal armor. So while a 90-pound draw weight bow isn't quite that hefty, it's still quite a bit. Paul and Bart would also go on to spend years teaching each other. They went with each other on hunts, camped together, went over the best practices and procedures, and in 1992, when Bart scored a very highly coveted Kodiak Island bear tag, Paul supported him on that hunting trip. And for those concerned that this seems like trophy hunting, it's really not. You have to go to these places and make sure that you actually cull the herds. So if you leave too many wild animals of any sort, whether it's deer with no natural predators or bear with too many deer, they will overeat, overpopulate, and go into a cycle where there's a crash because everybody starves. So every year, a limited number of people are allowed to go and hunt bear and deer and other creatures and critters on Kodiak Island and in other places like this, where the balance of nature might be a little bit off. Paul came along that trip, as did two friends, Brad and Jeff. Brad and Jeff were planning to primarily be hunting deer, but also be backup just in case it was needed, whereas Paul would be Bart's real backup, the guy that was up next to him with a bow to take the shot in case Bart missed and got charged by a bear. They spent several days tracking, and at a certain point, Jeff, who had to leave earlier than everybody else, went off on his own to hunt deer, but Brad stuck around with Paul and Bart. And eventually, they came across some tracks that suggested they were looking at a 10-foot tall grizzly bear. Now, Kodiak grizzlies are especially large for grizzly bears, so this was completely possible. It wasn't like they were looking at something giant. But keep in mind, the average man is 5'9", 5'10" in the United States and Canada, which means that they were still looking at something almost twice their size. Eventually, they did manage to come to a spot where they figured they could make the approach and actually take their shots. Brad could have come along up to the actual location where they would shoot, but instead he stayed back to film the hunt and also act as backup if necessary. As Brad sat down to film, Paul and Bart took off their boots so that they could move more quietly and with, better purchase on the ground, and crept within 20 yards of the bear. Bart lined up, drew back, and took a perfect shot right into the bear's chest. However, the bear was, a bear, and the arrow didn't properly stick. The bear was actually able to grab it, bite it, and pull it out, and then run off into the woods. As it retreated, Bart, not wanting to let the animal get away, took a couple more shots, but they missed. Now, you might think that Bart was really upset that he had not managed to kill the animal, and you're correct if you think that. But not for the reasons that he felt that he had missed out on some sort of trophy or some great achievement. Rather, he was worried that he had injured the bear and that it was going to live a long time in pain. So they set off into the woods to track it, hoping to put it out of its misery. Typically, hunters of the sort that Bart is try to take out an animal as quickly and painlessly as possible. The goal is to get your kill, because you're going to use the meat and the pelt and all of that, without causing the animal undue pain. When you're talking about, people who hunt for a living, that they do this to survive, they're typically very respectful of the wildlife. It's not about, getting one over and proving that you're the superior predator. It's about respecting the animal and providing for your own needs. And thankfully, this bear, which was an older female, actually didn't make it all that far into the woods. It was only 20 to 50 yards in when they managed to find the body. And she turned out to be smaller than expected, but was still a staggering 8 feet 9 inches tall. And after recording this kill and handling it, they just went off back to hunt deer with their buddies. Unfortunately, the early 90s would kind of be the high point of the 90s for Bart, because over the next couple of years, he would suffer some pretty significant hardships. On January 18th, 1993, Paul, being the daredevil that he was, died in a skiing accident. This is a little bit tragic because just a few months before Paul's death, Bart had taken an interest in becoming a bowyer himself. He wanted to go on making his own bows, and Paul was going to be a great resource for that. Not that there wasn't anybody else Bart could learn from, but Paul was one of his close friends, and learning from your close friends is always a great experience. And Bart got a really interesting opportunity when it came to making his own bows, because a little bit after Paul's death, Bart was invited to Siberia to study tigers. Dr. Maurice Hornacher was putting together a team of international scientists, trackers, and other associated degrees and fields to go out into the Siberian wilderness and track the endangered Siberian tiger. There's a very, very small population of them, and it was important that they track breeding patterns and monitor the health of kittens and things like that. So Bart went out there, and as he was tracking Siberian tigers, he of course came across Siberian tiger kills. And what he would do was take the sinew from those boar and, other various animals and use that to back his bows. So the kills of Siberian tigers became an integral part of the bows he was constructing. One of the most interesting parts of Bart's job as a Siberian tiger tracker was that while the tigers were out and about hunting, he got to crawl into their dens and just check out the kittens, hold them, weigh them, take pictures, make sure they were doing all right. Now, of course, if you are checking out a Siberian tiger's child and it comes back, you're going to be going toe-to-toe with an 11-foot-long big cat. And again, for those who don't use freedom units, that's about 3.3 meters. And earlier I mentioned grizzly bears were about 8 feet tall. That's slightly under 2 meters. And if you thought the tiger being 11 feet long was a problem in itself, it's also about 700 pounds. So even just knocking into you, it's going to hurt you. But Bart managed to use his skills as a grizzly bear tracker, track one of the most dangerous animals alive, and do it without ever getting hurt. Also, while working with this team in Siberia, Bart met a woman named Tatiana, and with her, he had a son named Artyom. But while having a family really excited Bart, he was starting to feel as though his family life and his career and his personal interests were all starting to tear him in different directions, and he no longer really had time for all of it. To make matters worse, he suffered yet another hardship in 1995. While on a hunting trip that he had put together in memorial of Paul with Brad and Jeff, Jeff left early because he had to go meet up with his wife to do some hunting further north. Unfortunately, Jeff's plane crashed, the plane he was piloting himself. Now, Bart and Brad actually wouldn't find out about the crash until days later when they made it home. Jeff died 2 years and 8 months to the day after Paul Schaefer. A little bit later, Brad and Bart would go off together on their own ceremonial hunting trip in honor of Jeff. So why did I just tell you all of this information about Bart's life and background? We don't usually do that. It's because it makes this next part really weird. On September 14th, 2004, Bart hopped onto a chartered float plane to head out to Reed Lakes in the Yukon Territory in Canada. At the time, he was living in Whitehorse, Yukon, which is about 175 miles southeast of Reed Lakes. Reed Lake sits deep within the heart of the Yukon Territory, between the lands of the, I'm going to try my best here, the Nacho-Nyak-Dun and Selkirk First Nations. The plan was to stay in the area for about 2 weeks with a pickup on September 27th. Now, I looked up the weather data for this time period, and it's pretty mild. When he arrived, the average temperature was 50 degrees Fahrenheit, or 10 degrees Celsius, with a high of 63 and a low of 39. During those 2 weeks, it would range from an average temperature of 26 degrees all the way up to 63 degrees. And, this is an important detail when it comes to some later stuff, it was clear skies the entire time. There was about 0.1 inches of precipitation. So, these were essentially perfect conditions. And furthermore, Bart was well equipped. He had 3 Rubbermaid Action Packer containers, the first of which contained food, mostly canned, the second, clothes, and the third, camping gear. He had packed enough food to last him that whole 2 weeks, and of course the plan was that he would be hunting, which meant that he would be able to acquire more food. On top of that, he had a tent, his sleeping bag, his bows, and an inflatable boat to get around the lake. The first things he did when he got there were set up his tent, inflate his boat, and eat a meal. And the problem is, that is all we know, because on September 27th, when that pilot returned, Bart was not there. His tent was there, his gear was there, the boat was half a mile down the lake somewhere, but no Bart. Immediately upon returning, the pilot reported him missing, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police set out a team of 6 men to the location of Bart's camp to look for him. They arrived on the 29th and spent the day poking around. They found the boat and went to check that out, but there was really nothing there. All they noticed was that it was tied up on both ends, so it seemed like Bart had secured it himself and was most likely wherever the boat was. They also determined that he had prepared 1 meal, but no fire had ever been lit, which would imply that Bart never made it back to that campsite after just even the first few hours. Wherever he put that boat, he did not come back. Now, it is assumed that Bart is the one who actually paddled the boat over to where it was found. It was tied off securely on both ends. He was nowhere to be found. His bows were nowhere to be found. There was really no reason to believe that anybody else would have moved the boat. The spot he chose is a little odd because there was really no shoreline. He had to actually secure the boat just to some brush, but Bart was a woodsman. He probably didn't really think much of it. But what's weird here, among many other things, is that the police determined that, you know what, they were just going to do an aerial survey. They couldn't really figure out what was going on, and anyway, the weather was deteriorating. Except the weather wasn't deteriorating. We have the records, and clear skies, not really that cold or hot, and very little precipitation. So why did they leave so early? And that was a question that was on the mind of a lot of Yukon residents. Because the police basically just said, well, maybe he just wandered off towards the highway or something, and then they went home. Now, his friends said that if Bart had just wandered off towards the highway and gotten away safely, he would have called them, and that seems likely. Bart was very communicative with his friends and family. And his friends were simply not satisfied with the RCMP's answers. So, one of them, a Dib Williams, called up a pilot buddy of his, a Wayne Curry, and the two made their own trip by float plane out to Reed Lakes. They found very little the first day, but his tent had been knocked down, and what they did find of his belongings was his backpack, his knife, an aircraft radio, and his bear spray. They flew home and then came back the next day, where they planned to investigate the boat. And it didn't take them all that long to find things. About 60 yards back into the woods from where the boat was, they found his bow, his quiver of arrows, and a dry bag that had an indentation making it seem as though Bart had been sitting on it. The bag, the bow, and the arrows were next to a thicket of spruce and willow trees that any archer could use as a spot to kind of watch game come and go. This was actually a perfect spot for Bart to be because he was trying to hunt moose, and he needed to be in an area where not only could they not see him, but more importantly, could not charge him. Moose are absurdly large. Feeling that they had found probably the best evidence they could, they decided to search the nearby area, and it did not take Dib and Wayne very long to find more evidence. They discovered a camouflage face mask with blood and hair on it, and that was all they needed to call the RCMP and tell them that, you know what, y'all need to get back out here. But the problem is, the RCMP used that as an excuse to halt the search. And at this point, there's a very big difference in reporting that crops up, because the halt happened on the 3rd of October, which makes it pretty clear that the Canadian police just decided Bart was dead. They weren't even going to look and see if they could find him alive. They were leaving him to die. And interestingly enough, in Whitehorse, on the 8th, in the Whitehorse Daily Star, there's a series of statements of fact. Most of them are wrong, including the date on which Bart's belongings were found, the fact that the police said they had suspended the search due to weather conditions, and something that a lot of residents pointed out that was odd, they decided to do an aerial search in one of the most densely wooded parts of the planet. The reporting that I've given that corrects these errors, if we're being generous, has all been from the Anchorage Daily News over in Alaska. And since everybody could kind of see that there was very little transparency going on here, that the story didn't really line up, and that nobody seemed to be trying to find Bart, the community of Whitehorse started asking questions. Questions like, why would they choose an aerial search in dense forest and against the advice of local residents? Was the decision to not do a ground search cost-related? Would efforts be more robust if more than one person was missing? Why bother training rangers if they weren't going to do their jobs? Why did the department not communicate with Bart's friends when they're the ones that found all of the evidence? If he was believed to be alive, would the search be more intensive? Now, Dib Williams and Wayne Curry discovered all of their discoveries on the 2nd of October. That means that their search began and found more a week after the RCMP said, there's nothing here. And coincidentally, the RCMP restarted their search on October 3rd. With questions mounting and the new evidence from Williams and Curry, the RCMP had no choice. They had to get back in there and investigate, because if they didn't, then, I don't know, everything had already been figured out. I guess they couldn't claim credit. A dozen searchers, including Mounties, conservation officers, and volunteers, went up to Reed Lakes to look for Bart's remains. They initially found nothing but wolf and bear scat, which told them that there were wolves and bears in the area, but absolutely nothing else. Eventually, they did spot a baseball cap, which led them towards his bow and arrows and his dry bag, which, of course, the other guys already knew about, so I'm not sure why they didn't just start there in the first place. But as we learned in our Nahanni Valley video, the RCMP not great at investigating wilderness stuff. However, they did find some more stuff that had not been caught by Williams and Curry. What they found, in addition to the bow and arrows, was a pair of torn up camouflage pants and a camera. Now, the camera did not have anything of any use on it, but the torn up pants did give them kind of an idea of what had happened, but pants weren't on anybody, and they were intact enough. But nearby, they did manage to find, sitting on a bed of moss in a spruce grove, some remains. Now, this included a partial skull fragment as well as a few bones. They were able to use the fragment of his skull to match dental records, which confirmed that this was the body of Bart Schleyer. And while they had found his pants, the rest of his clothing was absolutely nowhere. And even more oddly, none of the scat samples contained any clothing. They did contain bone fragments, but they had to send those off to a lab to determine if they were even human. By the way, couldn't find any reporting on whether or not those bone fragments turned out to be human or not. Now, why is it weird that there were no clothes in any of the scat samples? It's because grizzly bears are known to just eat the clothes of their victims if they attack a human being. For example, a year earlier in Alaska, a wildlife photographer had been eaten by grizzlies in a grisly manner, in that he actually caught the sounds of him being eaten on camera. And the thing about grizzlies is, and bears in general, is that they don't actually like kill you and drag you off to a den like a mountain lion might. In fact, they don't even bother killing you first. They will just start eating you alive, and they don't go for the neck. But they did actually manage to find and kill the bear that ate the Alaskan photographer, and in his stomach were a bunch of clothes. So the fact that none of the samples of scat contained clothes was a little weird. And keep in mind, this is not me saying these things are weird. This is the conservation officers. I'm taking their assessment. Furthermore, bears typically will leave their leftovers in a cache, which is typically buried slightly underground. They'll just take the leftover food and shove it under some dirt and come back for it later. And there had been a cache for the Alaskan wildlife photographer, but there was no cache in the area of Bart's remains. And there was also no sign of a struggle. Now, if anyone knew how to handle a bear attack, it was Bart Schleyer. And he knew that the best thing you can do is play dead, and after that, it's fight back with all you've got. Punch it in the nose, do everything you possibly can, and that would leave signs of a death struggle. There would be broken branches, there would be things knocked over, probably clothes and arrows and bow flung everywhere. A bear is not really a stealth predator, That's not their thing. They're not mountain lions. So why was there no sign of a struggle? Why were all of Bart's bow and his arrows, why are they all in the right spot, calmly, neatly lined up against a tree? Was he snuck up on and attacked by a random bear that didn't bother to do any of the normal bear things? It really doesn't make sense. What we really have to assume here is that in order for this to have been a bear that killed Bart, an 800-pound predator would have to sneak up on a hunter who specialized in hunting that specific predator. So it's just implausible that Bart would not have noticed or put up a fight if attacked by a grizzly bear. And if it had been wolves, there would have been signs as well. In fact, Yukon Conservation Officer Kevin Johnstone was quoted as saying, "It's not characteristic of a bear mauling site. It is inconclusive as to how Mr. Schleyer died." However, if you look up analysis of this case all over the place, what you're going to see is, it's a presumed grizzly bear attack. But the very people investigating it didn't think it was a grizzly bear attack. A wolf attack was considered, but there was still no evidence for that either. And that did leave other possibilities, other options, like, for example, a heart attack or a stroke, but Bart was an extremely healthy 49-year-old man, and that is still young for heart attack and stroke, even in people who aren't particularly healthy. So for somebody who spent his entire life eating good food, hunting, being out in the wilderness, living a very active life, to die of something that typically affects people who are sedentary seems really unlikely. Another searcher noted that Bart's baseball cap that they found was completely unblemished, and the bag he was sitting on, which contained food, remained unopened. So what kind of wild animal attacks somebody but doesn't tear open the bag with food in it? That's what bears are known for. They're more likely to come into your camp and take your stuff than they are to come into your camp and kill you. And another chink in the animal attack issue was Bart's supplies. They weren't that far away, only half a mile, and wild animals have fantastic sense of smell. There was canned food mostly, but not all of the food that Bart brought was canned. So presumably, an animal could have smelled it. If that's what it was, if this was a bear attack, why did it not go for the food? This is a question that stumped the bear experts. So if not a bear, then what? Some people suggested that it was humans, another hunter, a serial killer, but Bart's location, his exact location, was known only to the pilot who flew him there. And he was 15 miles of rugged forest terrain away from the nearest human settlement, which was, of course, nothing more than a truck stop called Stort's Crossing. There's a gas station, a convenience store, a few houses, and that's it. It's just another stop along the Klondike Highway. So it seems unlikely that it was just some other random person who came along and decided that Bart needed to go. And even still, would Bart get snuck up on by a random average Joe? If not an animal, then whoever killed Bart had to be a really talented hunter. And there's just no good explanation for it. And even the weirdest thing we've studied in the area, the Nahanni National Park Preserve, is still a couple hundred miles to the east. So, I mean, we're not that far from the same mountain range, but are we going to say that that whatever was killing people in Nahanni in the early 1900s still around and stalking people hundreds of miles to the west in the Yukon? It's hard to say. So what happened to Bart? Because it really makes no sense. There is no consensus on this. The bear experts say it probably wasn't a bear, and wolves don't make sense either. There's really no humans nearby to do anything about it. And even if there were, Bart's remains weren't in a state that suggested humans were involved. Unless those humans are a little bit less than human, or maybe a little bit different than us. You know, we talk about the often Canadian native legends of things like the Saskets and the pale-faced demons that supposedly exist in Nahanni National Park Preserve. Of course, those were reported by a man from Calgary who says natives told him about it, but either way. There's also, of course, the story of the Naha tribe that disappeared. Maybe they had some descendants who went off into the mountains to the west. It's hard to really come up with a conclusion. So, for me, this is again one of those cases, kind of like Carl Weathers, where I really just don't understand what could have happened. Garrett Bardsley, a mountain lion's plausible, if not likely. With Aaron Hedges, there was the fact that he was detoxing, but it was still weird that he went off in the direction he did. Some of these cases just really have no good explanation to them. Because again, it doesn't seem like it was a bear. It doesn't seem like it was a wolf. Mountain lions aren't in the area. So you run out of predators that are capable of taking down a full-grown man really quickly. And predators that take down a full-grown man and leave essentially no evidence of it, other than a scattering of a few bones, a pair of pants, and his neatly packed dry bag, bow, and arrows sitting against a tree. I'm at a loss for this one, and I kind of have to assume that it's something we don't know about yet, or that we haven't proven exists yet. But, as always, I'd like to know what you guys think. You can leave your suggestions down in the comments. You can discuss, debate with one another, do whatever you feel like. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can subscribe to us on Patreon. You can check out our Tableau Roasting Company coffee, Mount Pocono Perk. You can also buy any of the stuff on our Amazon storefront. You'll find all of these links in the description. So go down there, check it out, and do whatever you feel like. If nothing else, thank you for watching. Please like the video, share with a friend if you think it was interesting, and we will see you next time. I'm Eden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lower Lodge. I just realized we forgot to do it.